Greetings, everyone, and welcome to the penultimate chapter of our in-depth look at the complete series of Eerie, Indiana, episode-by-episode reviews. That's going to be a really long title to put in the title, isn't it? So I'm going to use a much shorter title like I've done for the past three. All right. So we'll be looking at Disc 4, which is episodes 12 through 15 of the series. And this is where things change a little bit from what we've seen thus far. So let's take a look today on the Multimedia Chronicles. Welcome back. All right, so episode 12 is entitled Tornado Days. Now, every year, like clockwork, Eerie, Indiana gets hit by a tornado that they've come to know as Old Bob. Now, generally speaking, it seems that this tornado has personality. Yes, it's actually sentient. Because as long as they have a celebration celebrating the coming of the tornado and have their Tornado Day festival, then the tornado passes by Eerie. But if even one person does not go to that celebration, the tornado will hit Eerie. So, yeah, interesting. Sentient tornado. Forget Sharknado. This is a sentient tornado. It will come and get you if you don't celebrate Tornado Day. So, so the tornado's getting close, and Marshall decides that it's just a bunch of hooey, and decides to just stay home and do his own thing. Simon wanted to go to Tornado Day. He entered the raffle and everything, but he, being Marshall's friend, begrudgingly decided to stick it out with Marshall. So they're just kind of doing their own thing, and suddenly they hear this horrendous crash outside, and they look out into the yard, and there's this big metal thing, like this sort of this I don't know how to describe it, almost like a submarine kind of, but like a small one-man kind of thing, and it's just like thunked onto the yard, and this man climbs out. And this man is basically a meteorologist. And Marshall says, "Oh wow, I've never met a weatherman before." And he's like, "Okay, I'm not a weatherman. I'm a meteorologist. I'm a scientist." And this meteorologist is played by none other than Matt Frewer. Yes, I don't even need to look him up on IMDb. Matt Frewer, Max Headroom himself, man. Come on, it was awesome. He was also the main villain in the Generation X TV movie. He also had just a heartbreaking role in the 2004 Dawn of the Dead remake. He was also in The Stand, and he's been in a million things over the years. Love Matt Frewer, great Canadian actor, who honestly I've always felt should have been more famous and well known than he is. But my personal favorite thing of everything he's ever done was, of course, Max Headroom. Love Max Headroom. So anyway, he plays the meteorologist, and basically his machine that's crashed in the yard is what he calls the Tornado Rider. And he has postulated that Old Bob is actually indeed sentient, that it's not just a superstition, that he actually is sentient. And he has this device that can record what he claims is the voice of the tornado. So he plays the recording for Marshall and says, "Yeah, you might want to be a little concerned," because he plays the recording and it's saying in this like windy, whispery voice, "Marshall Teller." Yeah, so Old Bob is out to get Marshall personally because he wouldn't go to Tornado Day. So basically, Marshall and Simon team up with the meteorologist and have to help him deal with the tornado. So the tornado rider is smashed. So the only other option is to find something else that he can use to ride up into the tornado, and deal with it and battle it out with them. So the raffle that Simon entered was for a camper, like a not an RV, but the kind you hook onto a truck, like camper trailer. Yeah, so one of those. So everybody's cleared out of the festival because they're terrified of old Bob, and they've all gone off to hide in their basements. And so Marshall basically just grabs all the tickets and just declares Simon the winner, and so they can get the camper and use it to send the meteorologist guy up into old Bob and deal with him. And there you go. So that's pretty much it in a nutshell. If you want to see how it turns out, watch the episode. Needless to say, lots of things go wrong in the process. So that kind of brings us up to the break point in Eerie, Indiana, and they had some repeats for a while. When it came back, things had changed slightly. The opening titles were ever so slightly different, had some different clips in there, from the last 7 episodes that were upcoming, rather than sort of the same sequence of clips that we'd seen in previous episodes. Also, the episode begins with the World of Stuff, and remember how Mr. Radcliffe was always kind of a shady character, and Marshall always felt like there was something up with him. Maybe he was in the witness protection program or something, but he constantly seemed to be wearing different outfits and different disguises and using different voices. Well, in this episode, we actually find out what the deal was. Apparently, Mr. Radcliffe was not Mr. Radcliffe. He was actually a guy by the name of Fred Suggs, who was a serial impersonator. So he would constantly, he just felt this compulsive need to constantly be other people. Or I guess a serial imposter is really what it was. So he had actually had the real Mr. Radcliffe, the real owner of the World of Stuff, tied up in the basement this whole time. So he's exposed and dragged away, and the real Mr. Radcliffe is brought out of the basement and is able to carry on running the World of Stuff. Now, the real Mr. Radcliffe is played by none other than Gomez Addams himself, John Astin. And holy moly, if ever there was an actor who would be right at home in Eerie, Indiana, it's John Astin. So that was a really pleasant surprise. And the thing is, I actually liked the other guy who played Mr. Radcliffe. I thought he played the character quite well. And, was very nice to Marshall and Simon and everything. And it's funny because Mr. Radcliffe, the real Mr. Radcliffe, says not to press charges against the imposter guy. And Marshall and Simon said, well, why? He kept you tied up in the basement the whole time. He says, well, yeah, but while he was running the store, I moved more merchandise than while I was running the store. So he's a hell of a salesman. So I can't hold a grudge against that. He made me a ton of money. It's like, okay, well, I guess that's that. So actually, the episode didn't open in the World of Stuff. I slightly misremembered that. It opened with Marshall and Simon investigating a haunted house. So it was this old mill that was disused. And they said, every house or every town has its share of haunted structures. So far, Eerie's had about 50 that we've investigated. Right now, we're investigating number 51. So number 51 is this haunted mill. So they go there and they see a bunch of strange goings on. There's like a chair floating, and they hear eerie voices, and they see this ghostly face appear in front of them, and it's like, ah! And then like they quickly whip up the camera and take a picture, and then continue screaming and run out of the place. But so they get to talking to new Mr. Radcliffe about this, and it's like, do you know anything about the old mill? And he's like, oh yeah, I know. And he tells them this story about Grungy Bill, who is this. He says he was the worst bank robber that Eerie ever knew. And he's like, oh, really? He was a real, bad guy? And it's like, no. It wasn't that he was bad. He was the worst bank robber. Like, he kept trying to rob the bank and just never managed to do it. He was just incompetent. So, yeah. So basically they go back and, and they're talking to him, and he's like, but, and they say that he went to rob the bank and he forgot his gun, and then he was killed. And they say that his ghost still haunts the old mill to this day. He keeps coming back there, still trying to find his gun. And he says, but of course, ghosts aren't real, right? And they're like, well, yeah, no, of course, ghosts aren't real. So they go back to the old mill to investigate, and find out. And looking around, they realize that they've been had. That the floating chair was pulled by wires. The ghostly voices, there was like a megaphone in the back. They can make ghostly voices. The ghostly face they saw was just a Halloween mask. And then they start to poke around a little more, and they find evidence that somebody's been living there. Somebody's been sleeping there at the old mill. There's like a sleeping bag and canned food and stuff. And then, as they're investigating, this kid shows up with gray hair. And he's got 2 marks on his hands. One is a dash, and one is an X. He later becomes known as Dash X. But the thing about this character is he doesn't know who he is. He doesn't know how he ended up in Eerie. He doesn't know his own name. They just come to refer to him as Dash X because of the marks on his hands. But there's a big mystery about him. Like he says that he just basically woke up and found himself in Eerie. So since then he's just been kind of trying to survive. So sleeping there and stealing food and such to get by. So he's a bit of a shady character. So he basically did the whole haunting thing, just going by the reputation of the mill and making it haunted, so people would stay away and leave him alone. So as they're talking to him and sort of trying to figure out what his motivations are, what's going on with him, they break a floorboard and they find a rusty old gun. And then as soon as they pull the gun out, the ghost of Grungy Bill appears. What is all this racket going on around me? I mean, I know there's the beeping, but there's other sounds from over there. Creepiness. Anyway, so the ghost of Grungy Bill is real. And he kind of becomes solid, and he captures everybody and says, you're going to help me rob the bank. So he captures Dash X and Simon, ties them up, and then takes Marshall off to the bank to rob it. He's determined to rob this bank no matter what. So now they've got an angry ghost, like a genuine angry ghost to deal with. Marshall's being forced to help him rob the bank against his will, and he's got to rescue his friends as well. So quite a scenario. Now, this episode isn't too bad. It's actually a lot of fun. It's great to see John Astin. The character of Grungy Bill is a lot of fun, too. He's just this ridiculously incompetent bank robber ghost who talks tough but is really inept. Now, I should mention that the introduction of Dash X, the story of Dash X would become sort of one of the continuing story arcs for the rest of the series at this point. What's he all about? What's his origins? What's his background? Things like that. It's one of the big mysteries. Now, fans have been kind of divided on the character of Dash X. I always found him a little bit abrasive. I mean, he's very much, kind of looks out for himself and doesn't really care about anybody else. Eventually he kind of begrudgingly becomes friends with Simon and Marshall and kind of helps them with their investigations and such. But in these earlier episodes, he's really a very unlikable character. I mean, he's a bit of a jerk and often kind of gets in their way when they're trying to investigate things and messes things up, which we'll talk about in one of the upcoming episodes here. But I'm kind of split on him. In some instances, I like him. In other instances, I just want to throttle him. A lot of fans describe him as the living embodiment of Eerie, Indiana, because he's just so strange. In fact, when Eerie, Indiana, The Other Dimension came along a few years later, well, 7 years later, actually, they didn't have a Dash X character. It was just strictly about the Marshall and Simon, the versions of Marshall and Simon in that dimension. So they had different names. It was like Mitchell and something else. I can't remember. It's been so long since I've seen that one, and it's not available on DVD either. I do have most of them recorded off TV, but I haven't watched them in ages, so I'm probably going to watch them again, actually, after watching this. So anyway, carrying on, next up we have, Mr. Chaney. Ha ha ha, Mr. Chaney. Oh, by the way, I should mention that Dash X is played by a young Jason Marsden. Yes, I'm not sure if there's any relation to James Marsden, but anyway, Jason Marsden, if you look him up on IMDb, hugely accomplished voice actor. He's been in like a ton of anime and video games as one of the English voice actors, and just a lot of animated shows. He's done a lot of voices over the years. So this is like one of his few sort of on-screen appearances, I guess, when he was just kind of starting out, and then kind of found his niche as a voice actor later. But yeah, I mean, he can be a fun character at times, and other times he can be just kind of grating. It seemed like they were kind of unsure what to do with the character initially. They just wanted to have this character to add a little bit more mystery into the show, and I guess to have an ongoing storyline. All right, so the next episode, Mr. Chaney. Every few decades, this is like 30 years or so. I can't remember exactly what the time frame is, but anyway. Yeah, and actually, this is the first episode that makes a direct reference to a previous episode. I mean, there was kind of a loose continuity that was apparent through the previous episodes, but this one actually makes a direct reference to the adventure with Grungy Bill in the previous episode. Marshall mentions that we haven't seen that gray-haired kid since our adventure, misadventure with Grungy Bill last week or whatever it was. So anyway, so they have this harvest festival. And they have a lottery for the harvest, and whoever wins the lottery becomes the Harvest King. Then the Harvest King goes out into the woods to meet the Eerie Wolf. And the funny thing is, nobody's ever seen any of these Harvest Kings since. So it's like they'll go off into the forest to meet the wolf, and they'll never see them again. Now, the official story is that they all went to Spain after, but apparently not. So, as a part of the Harvest Festival, there's this man named Mr. Chaney, and Mr. Chaney's job is to take the Harvest King into the forest to meet the Eerie Wolf. That's like his sole function. And Mr. Chaney, by the way, is played by Stephen Root, who is a character actor who I'm sure most of you will recognize. He had a great run, probably most prominently on news radio. He was like the news. He was like their boss. Very abrasive business type, hilarious character. I first remember seeing him actually in Crocodile Dundee, where he played like this FBI agent that was tailing Mick at one point. You may also remember him as Milton in Office Space. Yeah, so Stephen Root has definitely been around. He's done a lot of voice acting as well. He's got a great voice. He was in Trip in the Rift. He played like the space captain, the voice of the space captain in that. And he's been in a ton of stuff. Just look him up on IMDb. He's got a huge, huge list of credits, and probably mostly stuff you've seen. So anyway, through some convolution, originally the gray-haired kid was put on the ballot to be the Harvest King, and the reason being they had like a secret meeting of the mayor and Mr. Radcliffe and Mr. Chaney, and they're trying to decide who's going to be the next Harvest King, and they decide to make it the gray-haired kid just because he's new to Eerie. They don't like outsiders. Something doesn't sit right about him. So let's just take him right out of the picture. We'll have him go meet the wolf, and then he'll be taken care of and done. So they do that. However, the gray-haired kid overhears this and finds the ballot, crosses out his name, and writes in Marshall's name. So now Marshall is going to be the Harvest King. So he gets taken off with Mr. Chaney into the woods. And, well, I probably am not spoiling too much here to tell you that the Eerie Wolf is, in fact, a werewolf. And Mr. Chaney is, in fact, said werewolf. Hence why he only shows up every 30 years or so to take people into the forest to meet the wolf. And so basically Marshall has to deal with the werewolf all alone in the middle of the forest. Pretty crazy. As to how it turns out, well, you're just gonna have to watch the episode and find out. Don't you love how I do that? Amazon link in the description. Alrighty, so the final episode on this disc is No Brain, No Pain. So in this one we have basically this sort of homeless guy who is just kind of wandering around, and there's all kinds of rumors about who he is and what his deal is. Some people think he's an axe murderer. Some people think he's just crazy. They don't know. So Marshall and Simon are kind of curious about him. They think like, oh, maybe there's just something seems to be a little bit off about this guy. Maybe there's something more about him. So they're kind of investigating, and he keeps talking about his Sharona. It's like, I have to find my Sharona. And needless to say, there's references to the song "My Sharona," and you hear the song, if you riffs of it and stuff. So as it turns out, so they bring him back to Marshall's place, and they clean him up and tidy him up and stuff, and they say like, "Oh, this is my uncle." So Marshall and Simon follow him, and suddenly there's this mysterious woman shows up with like just a big red afro and sort of green jumpsuit and like a freaking laser gun, and blasts him. And he gets like sent flying back, and then Marshall and Simon rush to help him, and then Dash X shows up and distracts the lady, and then so in the end she takes off, Dash X takes off, and then Marshall and Simon are left with the homeless guy who's kind of incapacitated. And it's like, what's going on here? Like, obviously there's something more to this guy than just a crazy bum on the street. So Marshall takes him back to his place, and they clean him up. And they're trying to talk to him and trying to figure out, what the deal is. Like, why was that lady after you and stuff like that. So they clean him and they shave him. They cut his hair. They put new clothes on him so that he looks presentable and people won't recognize him as the bum on the street. So he tells his sister Cindy that he's just, this is my... Simon just says, it's my uncle visiting from out of town and stuff like that. So they just kind of plop him next to Cindy while they're watching soap operas. Meanwhile, Dash X meets up with the red-haired woman and basically makes a deal with her. She gives him money and says, there's plenty more of that if you bring me the guy. So, yeah. So it turns out that this guy is actually a brilliant scientist who created this machine that could store people's brains on an 8-track tape. In this case, his brain is stored on an 8-track of My Sharona. And so Marshall and Simon are actually going through his stuff in his shopping cart and find all the components of this brain-switching machine and figure out how to piece it all together. So then Simon actually ends up, getting zapped by it, and he has the brain of the scientist guy. So the mind of the scientist guy is put into his head, and his brain is put onto the Sharona tape. So then they got to find the scientist guy. They got to, because he's been captured, and they got to find Dash X, and they got to find the woman. They got to figure out what's going on, and it's just a big kerfuffle. So there's a lot of stuff they need to figure out and get done there. And they got to put a stop to it because this woman basically wants this machine for nefarious purposes, and they can't let that happen. So, yeah, good stuff. Good stuff. We actually do get to see a little bit of Dash X in action and actually being helpful, but then he turns on them and accepts the bribe and allows the woman to capture the guy. He does have a change of heart by the end of the episode, however, so it shows that he's not completely irredeemable. You get the impression, like, okay, maybe they're going somewhere with this character. They're kind of showing him as this scoundrel to begin with, but he's evolving. So, see how it goes from there. As to how it goes, well, we've only got 4 more episodes to find out, so we'll have to check those out next week and see how it all ends. Will we find out what the big mystery is with Dash X? Who knows? We'll take a look next time at the final 4 episodes of Eerie, Indiana. I should mention also, still at this point, he's not referred to as Dash X. He's still just referred to as the kid with the gray hair. Alrighty, well that is it for this time, folks. So quick thank you to my Patreon sponsors, especially Kyle Pellegrini and Get Your Gorgeous On, the always wonderful e-mag maintained by Michelle O'Toole and Simon Hedger. And we'll see you next time. So until then, thanks for watching, and Simon Hedger. Simon Hedger. And sayonara. Those two sound very similar. I've never made that mistake before, and I'm leaving it in.